Hey guys, welcome back, or maybe just welcome. If this is your first time drifting into one of these late-night history rambles, go ahead and dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, and let your brain float into neutral. Tonight's little lullaby for the historically curious is about swimming. Yes, the noble art of flailing around in water without drowning. Now, for most of us, swimming is kind of obvious. You either learned in school or you got tossed into the deep end at some childhood pool party, and your survival instincts handled the rest. But in the Middle Ages, swimming was basically filed under things peasants did before they died of something else, which is to say, not really a priority. See, medieval people had a complicated relationship with water. On one hand, rivers were everywhere. People drank from them, washed in them, and sometimes dumped less sanitary things into them, which, spoiler, did not make them safer to swim in. On the other hand, water was also deeply symbolic. In religion, water was sacred, think baptism, cleansing, all that holy imagery. But actually getting in and paddling around? That was considered vaguely suspicious. Leisure swimming wasn't relaxing summer hobby. It was, why is this person willingly throwing themselves into nature's toilet bowl? And here's the thing, in early medieval times, some people did swim. We know because a few manuscripts and scattered accounts mention nobles showing off their aquatic skills. The famous example is Charlemagne. Yep, the big man himself, Holy Roman Emperor, liked to take a dip. Chroniclers say he enjoyed bathing with his entourage in natural hot springs, which sounds relaxing until you realize entourage meant like 100 people, all splashing around together in the 9th century equivalent of a YMCA hot tub. Imagine the smell. But while Charlemagne may have been happily soaking, ordinary people weren't exactly diving in. There was this lingering fear of water as a dangerous, unpredictable element. Remember, there weren't lifeguards, flotation devices, or even much understanding of tides and currents. Falling into a river could be a death sentence. And swimming ability was so rare that medieval law codes actually had provisions for people drowning. Like, oh well, he fell in, and that's that. Nobody expected you to know how to save yourself. Which leads us to one of the most curious little facts. When swimming was taught, it was often military. Because of course it was. Soldiers might need to cross rivers during campaigns. Manuals from later centuries show men in armor being instructed on swimming techniques, which, yes, included floating on shields or holding on to inflated animal bladders. Just picture a row of grown men clinging to pig stomach balloons while trying to look intimidating. By the High Middle Ages, swimming had taken on an even weirder cultural baggage. Church authorities sometimes frowned on it because, apparently, being half-naked and wet was just one more opportunity for sin. Public bathing was already a moral minefield, and swimming could be seen as too indulgent, too physical, too close to fun. And you know what medieval Europe did with fun? It killed it. That's not to say people didn't bathe. They did, at least until the Black Death convinced everyone that water carried disease, which made baths suddenly unfashionable. But even before then, swimming was socially complicated. Knights might train for it, peasants might occasionally splash around in rivers, but most people, they stayed dry. So what happened when medieval people did try to swim? Honestly, a lot of floundering. Records tell us of knights drowning while trying to ford rivers on campaign, of noble children falling into moats, of peasants swept away by floods. Survival swimming wasn't exactly a skill set you picked up in your village. Let's drift now to another odd corner of this topic, the role of swimming in medieval imagination. Because while few were doing it, plenty were writing about it. Heroic epics sometimes feature characters swimming mighty rivers or fighting sea monsters mid-dog paddle, which tells you something. Even in fantasy, swimming was treated like a rare and almost superhuman act. The average reader was probably impressed not by the monster fighting, but by the fact the guy didn't immediately sink. And yet, across cultures, a few exceptions pop up. In Scandinavia, where water was pretty unavoidable, some sagas mention swimming contests. Vikings apparently saw it as a manly skill, right up there with sword fighting and growing a majestic beard. Meanwhile, down in the Mediterranean, where the climate was friendlier and the water clearer, swimming was more accepted. But Northern Europe? Land of murky rivers and suspicious clergy? Not so much. So the short version is, medieval swimming was rare, semi-military, occasionally sinful, and usually fatal. A perfect recipe for awkward cultural attitudes. But don't close your eyes just yet. We'll drift into some actual stories of medieval royals and nobles trying, sometimes disastrously, to swim, and how these watery escapades became part of their legend. Alright, so now that we've set the scene where swimming was about as common as personal hygiene, we can float into the fun part. The actual people who tried it. Spoiler, it did not usually end well. Let's start with the nobility. Because when you put someone in silk robes, tell them they're chosen by God, and then ask them to paddle through a freezing river, you know exactly how that's going to go. One of my favorites is Frederick Barbarossa. Yes, the famous German emperor of the 12th century. A man whose very name means red beard, which sounds intimidating, but whose end was anything but glorious. In 1190, during the Third Crusade, Frederick and his army were trudging across Anatolia. The heat was brutal, the armor heavy, and morale low. So when they came upon a river, Frederick, being the bold medieval man he was, decided to swim across. You can guess the punchline, he drowned. Just like that, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, felled not by Saracens, not by assassins, but by water. Imagine leading tens of thousands of men into the desert, only to have your great leader vanish under the current like a clumsy Labrador. And Barbarossa wasn't the only one. A lot of knights and nobles found themselves in watery trouble during campaigns. It was one of the great ironies of medieval warfare. You could spend decades mastering how to swing a sword while wearing 40 pounds of steel, but the moment you had to cross a river, the whole chivalric order just sank. There are chroniclers who describe whole cavalry charges coming to an end because knights fell into rivers and, predictably, went down like stones. Turns out plate armor does not make for buoyancy. Who knew? But even outside of war, royals and nobles had their little run-ins with swimming, or at least trying to. Take William the Conqueror's sons, for example. William Rufus, the red-haired king of England, reportedly enjoyed hunting and other outdoorsy stuff. Swimming, though, not so much. Chroniclers suggest that Anglo-Norman nobles looked down on it as something peasants did. Getting wet and half-naked was considered undignified, unless, of course, you were being dunked in holy water by a bishop. The irony is, medieval literature kept celebrating swimming feats. In the Song of Roland, there's a bit about men swimming rivers in full gear, heroically surviving. In the Nibelungenlied, Siegfried basically treats rivers like crosswalks. But again, this was fantasy. Real nobles were not cutting epic figures in the water. They were more likely to drown in a moat after one too many goblets of wine. Speaking of moats, yes, people did fall into them. Castles loved their defensive water features, but the practical result was that, occasionally, royals ended up flailing in muddy trenches. There are stories of noble children slipping and being dragged out by servants, or worse, not being dragged out at all, which, by medieval standards, was just another Tuesday. And then, of course, there were the religious associations. Swimming could look suspiciously like bathing for fun, which was often frowned upon. Monks weren't exactly encouraged to strip down and practice their butterfly stroke. Still, there are hints that some clerics could swim or at least float. A few accounts mention monks crossing rivers by holding onto logs, basically the medieval version of a pool noodle. Meanwhile, peasants sometimes did swim, especially if they lived by rivers or the sea. But here's the catch. Nobody cared enough to write about it. Chroniclers weren't interested in whether some fisherman's kid could do a decent dog paddle. Which means all our surviving stories are about nobles, who, as we've established, were usually terrible at it. So, in the medieval historical record, swimming comes across as rare, disastrous, and vaguely comical. And the funny part is, when you compare Europe to other parts of the world, it looks especially bad. Arab writers, for instance, commented on how Europeans didn't seem to know how to swim. And in cultures where swimming was normal, like in the Islamic world or coastal Asia, the idea of elite warriors drowning in puddles must have seemed ridiculous. Which, honestly, it was. So, what happened when medieval people tried to swim? Well, if they were peasants, probably nothing, maybe they managed fine. If they were royals, though, the odds of ending up as a soggy cautionary tale were alarmingly high. And with that gentle thought, let's let the river current slow down. Tonight we've drifted through the muddy waters of medieval swimming, from emperors sinking like anvils to Vikings showing off in fjords. Swimming was not a medieval pastime. It was an accident waiting to happen, occasionally wrapped in heroism, usually ending in embarrassment. So next time you dip your toes in a pool, be grateful you don't live in a world where trying to swim could get you labeled sinful, or accidentally drowned in front of your army. And on that sleepy note, close your eyes, float along, and we'll pick up another historical oddity next time.